Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. As part of our celebration of spooky season, the MCP is proud to present a special interview with Ryan Matthew Cohn and Regina Marie Rossi, curators of a vast collection of oddities and antiquities, the minds behind the Oddities Flea Market, and authors of The Witch's Door, Oddities and Tales from the Esoteric to the Extreme. The book, which is a combination memoir and exploration of their vast collection, comes out on October 1st. I'd also like to apologize in advance for my voice. It's spring in Melbourne, and with all the weird and beautiful flowers popping up, the pollen count is insane. Without further ado, let's dive into it. Hello.
Hello.
Where are you right now?
Australia, right?
I'm in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to the Morbid Curiosity Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. You have a very beautiful podcast voice.
Oh, thank you. Actually, do you, Regina, remember contacting me 6 years ago? You sent me a DM.
What did I say?
You said, I think you were on a road trip and you said you were listening to the podcast and that you were using it to get to sleep.
That sounds about right. I can see that. I can see saying that because your voice is amazing.
Well, thank you. I was completely starstruck, so I was very excited to to get that DM.
I definitely have a thing with voices. It's also one of the reasons that I started talking to Ryan, because I would have oddities on in the background while I was like cleaning my house because I loved his voice.
I've been a big fan of oddities for a while, and I think I first heard about Ryan, the Oddities Flea Market as well, through Instagram. And I had been searching through to find, I think I was doing an episode on shrunken heads, and I had searched through and found something that you had written, an article about shrunken heads.
Yeah, that was some time ago. Yeah, I think I had written an article actually about shrunken heads and, the ins and outs of the process and, where shrunken heads are today.
For the listeners, can you explain what oddities are and why they hold such interest for you both?
You want to start, Reg?
No.
What oddities are? I think oddities are really in the eye of the beholder. I think there's very stereotypical oddities that, if you were to say that name in terms of like, what are collectible oddities? Certain things come to mind, like osteological specimens or taxidermy or, Halloween related things. I guess oddities really are things that are odd in nature, things that are out of the ordinary, out of the box, and not your typical type of thing.
True. Like it doesn't always mean a skull or a dead thing or a creepy thing.
Yeah, and it's actually somewhat of a movement in a community. So oddities has something to do with that as well. So it's not just objects. It's a way of life for some of us, I think.
I would definitely agree.
But, in our field, oddities has really focused more on the collecting side of things. So, when I say to someone, hey, I have an oddities collection, if someone were to ask, what is that? It tends to be things that might have to do with death, mortality, thought-provoking things, and historical items that tell a story. Those are what oddities are, I think, to me individually.
I would agree with that. The story part in particular is what draws me in for any sort of oddity collecting, oddities and antiquities, that is. I read the advanced copy of the book. It took me an afternoon. It was really good. I very much enjoyed reading it. In the first chapter of the book, Ryan, you discussed your fascination with exploded skulls and how you would sit in museums and draw the artifacts there. And that's pretty familiar to me back in the days without internet, hanging out at museums. How old were you when you attempted to prepare your first exploded skull?
I think that it more has to do with my fascination with anatomy. So I actually started to learn about anatomy first. Ever since I was a little kid, I would draw illustrations of skeletons and, animal skeletons and the muscular system. I really started to delve into what makes up the human body. And then as I got a little bit older and had more resources, I started to actually put physical skeletons together. Might be things that I found in the woods, We lived in upstate New York. So if you just trotted off into the woods, you might find a half-eaten deer skeleton. And, you like leave it out so the flesh would sort of decay from it, or beetles and insects would do the work for you. But then you would be left with a skeleton, and it was fun to try to figure out loosely how things went back together. So the fascination really started there. And then, later on, I'd say in my 20s, I started to evolve into the artistry of skeletal articulation on a more, finite scale, which led me to exploded skulls.
I remember the first day that I saw an exploded skull. It was in the osteological lab at the university that I was going to, and I couldn't believe it, how intricate the work is to create those. Did you have any sort of training for that?
No, and I think that most of my training was just reading, especially when I was younger. Like yourself, we didn't have the internet yet. When I was a kid, the internet was just coming out. So you weren't able to use like the resources that we have today. You can literally look up anything and find a million examples of it. When I was a kid, if I needed any kind of resources, I went to the library. And so that was my best form of resource. To make a long story short is that, yes, I studied, but on my own. I didn't have any formal training. And it wasn't even like with the osteological stuff as I progressed as someone studying osteology. I didn't have like a medical field background, and I didn't study with any individual. I had pointers that were given to me by other people. For the most part, it was done by looking at things and then trial and error. And that was really my best teaching aid.
That's amazing. Good on you. Gosh, the motivation.
Right. Multi-talented. You're an incredible artist as well.
Yeah, well, it started with illustration. And in fact, that's what I was going to go to school for, was medical illustration. And I thought, like, I don't want to go to school to become a doctor, though I did have interest in that. I just didn't have, I think I'm probably dyslexic. I'm not great at reading, can't focus for long periods of time. And the thought of like going to school for 6 to 10 years was very unappealing. So I was like, oh, well, I love anatomy. I don't know if I necessarily want to save someone's life, but medical illustration might be the easy route to go. It's funny because like today, it's really cool in like our world to become an embalmer or practice mortuary science. And I know a lot of people that do it.
When we were growing up, it was unheard of. Like people our age in school were not ever thinking like that.
Nobody. And like you might know like one person that was studying under like some old guy.
I didn't.
But I didn't know a lot of people. Now you can go on like Instagram and there's like 100 people that is their whole MO is to educate people about mortuary science. And it's really cool. I wish I had that when I was a kid.
Same.
You mentioned in the book, both of you in your chapters, about provenance or the history of the items and that being important to you both. How do you go about seeking out the provenance, and what can you do if it's been lost?
Well, that's like
faceted.
Yeah, multifaceted. It's like a piece by piece basis. So, for instance, if I'm buying, a really prominent artwork from a prominent auction house, typically I'm not going to spend that much money on it if it doesn't have provenance. So, most likely, depending on how much you're spending on something, provenance is going to come with the item. Otherwise, you're not even going to inquire about it. However, there's plenty of times where I'm out in the field, literally at like a flea market or an antique show, and someone has something truly spectacular, but there is no provenance attached to it. It then becomes our jobs as curators, historians, I guess I should say pseudo-historian, to locate that provenance or try to find out as much as I can based on what I have in front of me and my resources. And then there's certain things that are aesthetic that don't need a provenance. But for, most of our collection, for the most part, I think we have some either story, history, or actual like paperwork that goes along.
Yeah, I mean, when we first met and we were getting emailed about someone passed away and a woman would say like, please come to my house because my husband had a few items and I want you to look at them. They didn't have provenance, but they've been in the family maybe for generations.
Sure.
And then usually somebody's like, okay, I don't want this or take it off my hands. But then there's like the story going back to the book, the big collections that we buy, like we're talking about Nick Parmesan. He had incredible paperwork that we found connected to tons of the pieces that, we procured in that collection.
Tons of provenance, but then oftentimes you literally are basing something that you have on a story.
Yeah.
And I think those can be really important pieces of provenance sometimes too, depending on the piece. You might have some like wonderful painting and it might not be worth anything, but you have this wonderful story that goes along with it. Whether it's true, you never really know. And that's what I like about this stuff. You become an investigator.
And also, like, you were kind of the first with Instagram starting to talk about these objects. I feel like nobody can get one past you, because you'll see things posted from a collector and it'll say something and you're like, no, I know this piece from like 15 years ago and I know exactly where it came from. So we see that kind of thing all the time. And that's kind of hard to deal with, but it is what it is.
It's hard to actually tell someone, and I very rarely do this because it always leads to negativity or a conversation that is, there's always like some rebuttal. But I try not to call out pieces that I deem fake or, misquoted or incorrect. I do it myself sometimes. There's been plenty of times where I posted something on Instagram, called it this or that, and then someone else feels the need to chime in. And like, sometimes they'll say, oh, great, thank you so much. I actually was under the impression that it was this. You've now informed me that it's this, and let me do some more research. That's the great thing about Instagram. It's really become like this community of people that are like-minded.
Most of the time.
Exactly.
Yes, most of the time, yeah.
With the occasional person that feels they know more than you. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not.
Well, sometimes they may know more than us, but the way they are choosing to tell us is not fun.
It's all about delivery.
Yes, exactly. All about delivery. There you go, yeah. You mentioned in the book that you're grateful to your mentors for teaching you to respect the skulls and skeletons of all creatures and to abide by the laws when collecting oddities in particular. In the chapter about shrunken heads, you stated that in the past and still somewhat today, collectors and even museums have been less than concerned with how their objects were acquired. Could you go into detail a little bit about the ins and outs of ethical collecting and the pitfalls that less scrupulous collectors might fall into?
Well, there's plenty of that going on. What's the word? Scrupulous. I love that.
I
love that word. Yeah, that's a great word. And I don't use it I tend to say salacious.
That's a good one too, though.
I think more recently than not, museums have been paying more attention to the ethics of their collecting. And as a result, it's led to a lot of pieces being removed from permanent collections or placed in the back rooms until more information was provided. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a good and a bad thing because many of the pieces, well, I'll use an example. The Museum of Natural History has removed all human remains from their collection. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anything that's human and material is now made of plastic.
Because they used to have a shrunken head.
Yeah, they used to have a number of them actually. And they had probably the most rarer examples that I've seen. However, then there's places like Ripley's, believe it or not, that still have many. I think they have like 20 in their New York City location. I think that it's very important to know what you have for a number of different reasons. I think you need to know laws because there are a lot of laws when it comes to collecting oddities in general. That can be, if we're talking specifically about, a human skull, for instance, there's certain states that you can't sell them in. There's certain states where they can't cross state lines. And then there's other states where you literally can't deal and or have them at all. So you need to know this stuff going into it. And research is your best friend. That's the same thing with certain types of taxidermy or animal specimens. So the more you know, the better. And I think oftentimes it actually just boils down to ethics. Something might not necessarily be illegal, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily okay to have it. And that's something we pay extremely close attention to throughout our whole careers.
Use your gut on that one.
Yeah, use your gut and just try to do the right thing. If someone were to ask my opinion or my advice, and I would also, that's another question we're asked a lot is like, how do you create such a huge collection? Well, it happens over a really long period of time. Don't just like end up with 3,000 pieces and then call it a day. Our collection took us a long time together, but has taken my whole life to put together.
And it's ever evolving as well.
Sure.
As we lose interest in some subjects, I feel like this past year we're more into art, even might I say modern, which is shocking to some people.
Well, I think I was actually very close-minded to art. And I hate to say that as someone in my mid-40s that I was close-minded to art because I'm always like, oh, art, art, art. I love all art and I do love all art. But I think just for our own personal collection, we heavily focused on antique art, obviously of a specific subject matter, of course. But more recently with one of the collections that we talk about in the book, the Richard Harris collection, he literally changed my whole mindset on what beautiful art is, what important art is. And much of it happened to be contemporary.
Which makes me really happy because I'm much more attracted to modern. Still like the macabre genre, but
Oh, yeah.
I love it all. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I have looked into some of the anatomical drawings by Vesalius.
oh
Oh,
yeah.
Vesalius fan
Yeah.
over here.
Those are much more artistic than just regular anatomical drawings, and I love them. They're amazing.
He's the best.
Yeah, he's like the OG of anatomist. I have a couple original Vesalius lithographs,
Oh, that's
but
amazing.
none of his books, unfortunately.
We always walk into this one shop in Palm Beach
Mhm.
because they have, what do they have there?
I think
Behind
that's-
glass.
Yeah, Raptise books.
Mhm.
Raptise, I think you say it. They have a couple of examples of Vesalius, but those can go between
Wait, what's the price tag? It's
between $500,000 and $3 million.
Yeah.
I mean, my friend just purchased one for I think 1.3 million, just sold at Christie's, if I remember correctly.
Oh my goodness.
And that was annotated, so that actually had the writings from most likely someone in the medical field from long ago.
That's amazing. Have you been to the Pitt Rivers Museum?
I love the Pitt Rivers Museum, but no, I've not been. And they are another example of deacquisitioning.
That's what I was thinking.
They had, I think, one of the more impressive collections of shrunken heads in the world, maybe. I don't know how many they had, but they had some of the finest examples that I've seen. And they removed them. And there was a lot of controversy attached to it because I don't know if they repatriated them. A lot of the times what happens is museums will try to repatriate something back to their country of origin. And sometimes they'll take them back and other times like they don't want them. And I've seen footage of Ecuador, actually, one of their cultural heritage centers. And they're probably offered a shrunken head every week, I would imagine, because there are quite a lot of them out there in circulation. They don't have anywhere to put them. They're never going to be on display again. And maybe some people agree that they shouldn't be. But I think that's really up to the institution. I'm not for whitewashing stuff. I'm very much into learning why something has maybe a dark history or a negative history. There's a tale to tell, and I think there's something to learn from some of these objects that could be construed as being uncomfortable to look at.
Yeah, ongoing conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, that's definitely an ongoing conversation. It's a tricky one because I feel like you're correct in that the learning is very important and we need to highlight where these things have come from and what was done to get them, like with Sansas or shrunken heads in particular. White folks came and thought they were cool, and so the peoples made more war and traded Sansas for guns and things. And a lot of people don't know that and where they came from at all.
Well, and then there was also a trade that a lot of people don't talk about because there was such a need by the Europeans for shrunken heads. They became like the focal point of most cabinets of curiosity during the 19th century. They were taking cadavers and using the head skin to create a shrunken head. I have seen, and I can go into most collections, and if they have many shrunken heads, I can usually pinpoint one and say, guess what? That's a cadaver head. And there's a telltale sign that you can tell. What's the telltale sign? There's almost always a seam across the forehead. Yeah. And what artists would do at the time, or people that were creating these cadaver head shrunken heads, is they would put like a little headdress of feathers.
Oh, to cover it?
To cover it. And that's usually what would go over that seam. But that's usually how you can tell whether one was made with a cadaver head.
There were some that were also made out of primate skulls as well, wasn't there? Or primate skin.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's several different versions of that. I mean, there's really, really amateur ones that are made out of goat skin and they don't look all that real. But if you were to look at like a gaff of a shrunken head, that's typically what you're seeing is just like a cheap goat head, shrunken head that, they basically sold those things at like the local carnivals. But yes, then there are monkey heads that don't look all that humanistic. They'll usually have like a little bit too much facial hair for the obvious reason, but they still kind of look like a primate. There's also sloth heads, but those don't look very humanistic. But the reason why the sloth head was used is that the Ecuadorians believed that they embodied the soul of an old human being. So oftentimes they would use those as kind of like an ancestor shrunken head, or sometimes referred to as practice heads. But then they would shrink the head of a sloth. I actually shrunk the head of a sloth on the TV show Oddities in my backyard in Brooklyn.
Oh, wow. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
No sloths were hurt in the process.
Okay.
No, that was actually a skin that was given to us from a taxidermist who had it in his freezer for many, many years. He procured it from, I think it was like a sloth sanctuary where one had passed away, and they were donated to him. And then we procured the skin, and then I went through the actual process and I shrunk it in my backyard, much to my landlord's chagrin.
Oh, Deborah.
Deborah never looked at me the same way.
I guess shrunken heads are a good stepping off point. Throughout the book, you mention that these collections of death masks and antique medical instruments and skulls and skeletons can help us come to terms with our mortality. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I think if anything, one of my fascinations, at least, and you can, tell me about yours, but when I was started to collect things like medical instruments and death masks or memento mori related pieces, especially the instruments reminded me as how far we've come with medical science and technology. And so to think when I'm looking at, like, I'm actually looking at one right now because we're in our library right now that has some of our tools, to think that this primitive trephination set, and if you don't know what trephination is, it's basically a boring device tool that was used to cut a hole into the head. And there was a lot of different reasons as to why this was done. One was like headaches, pressure buildup from your neurospinal fluids, or in battle, if someone got like knocked on the head and had a fracture, you would cut around that fracture so it didn't penetrate your brain, the bone fragments, kill you. So just thinking that like someone would get banged in the head, have a fracture, and then someone would come and just like cut holes in your head is absolutely horrifying. Of course, we have a lot very modern technology that can do that with much more ease, I guess we could say. So I think having a lot of these things around me made it almost like okay to learn about death and accept death. This is not a very morbid house, despite some of the objects. Oh, maybe you think of this, Reg.
Certain areas of the house are a little morbid.
But, I accept death. I like to learn about death because death is the only thing that we have with one another. It's the only thing that every one of us has in common. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. And I think that's what fascinated me with that genre so much. You could be the poorest person in the world or the richest person in the world, and you both have exactly the same thing in common. You're going to be born, you're going to die. It's inevitable.
I had a professor who used to say that human life is a sexually transmitted disease that is 100% fatal.
I like that.
I just also wanted to mention, I also have a trephine sitting in front of me on my bookshelf.
Oh, nice.
I used to work for a veterinary medical museum, and I was in charge of their accessions and deaccessions. So I definitely came away with a couple of the objects that they didn't want anymore but didn't know what to do with.
Oh, nice. People ask that a lot, or you'll see an item marked as deacquisition from a museum. And most of the time, they don't deacquisition things. Like if it's in the permanent collection, it's pretty rare that it will just like get given away or given to another collection. But it does happen on occasion. Museums oftentimes will have stuff sitting in a storage unit and just throw it out. And more often than not, I've seen things that were basically saved from the dumpster.
Yeah, that's where a lot of, I guess I have a collection, but a lot of my stuff comes from that job and other jobs where they just were like, well, we're going to toss all of this. And I was like, you can't toss this. I find it really difficult to throw historic items away.
Same.
I imagine a lot of people don't know the value of something or how rare something is too. I'm sure.
Yeah, but I think about that instance with the Brooklyn Museum. So the Brooklyn Museum in Brooklyn, New York, has one of the largest collections of Egyptian mummies. And I remember we did a segment for the show Oddities there, and they basically said, we're probably offered an Egyptian mummy every month or something.
They have no room.
And they have no room to house them in the permanent collection or in the back room. Like at some point, you would run out of space. And how many mummies do you really need on display? So it leads me to believe, like, what happens with that stuff? Is it better off sitting in a back room? Is it better off, like, you would never be able to get that back to Egypt, nor would they want it? Where does it go?
That is deeply thought-provoking. Are they at least cared for and maintained in the back rooms? Yeah.
Sometimes.
Isn't there that sad story in Paris?
The De Putron.
Yeah.
I'm butchering the French, but that was a medical physician's museum that was part of a university. And from my understanding, what happened was people were like stealing specimens. And that happened over decades. Something would get taken here, something would get stolen there. Same thing with catacombs. And so they just got sick of it. And I heard that they removed it for that reason. It just became too salacious of a story to keep going like, oh, a skull is stolen from a historical medical museum in Paris. It's not a good look. It's not a good headline. And so they ended up sticking the whole collection, as far as what I'm told, into the basement. And it probably won't see the light of a day. It's really kind of a shame because that was one of my favorite museums in Paris.
I just worry about like bugs and dust rust and mold and things. All these things that.
Well, that's a valid concern because that does happen. I mean, I have pieces that I just, aren't important to me that have like sat down in my basement. They're collecting dust, or like the liquid from like an old pickled fox head or something that I had when I was a kid is evaporated and it's starting to mummify. So it's like
they actually have to be tended to.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially pickled specimens have to be filled every so often, which when you go to a medical museum, there's like a little perforation at the top covered in wax. That's how they add liquid over a period of time.
Oh, I didn't know that. I honestly had no idea how they would add things back in or that it needed to be. So fascinating.
Sometimes we critique. We're like, hello.
Yeah, I'm actually not the person you want to have at your museum.
Oh, right. Yeah.
We were actually just in Seattle and we went to Yield Curiosity Shop, like a roadside attraction, even though it's in a bustling part of Seattle. And they have a couple shrunken heads and some medically mummified mummies, which is troubling because a medically mummified mummy is just that. It's a mummy that was basically pickled and then left to dry. Some of them would be injected with things like arsenic and other types of chemical, mercury, things that would preserve the skin. But I noticed on theirs that it was leaking oils. And so what was happening is it was starting to attract moths.
Everything was wet and you could actually see moths if you stared at it. And of course we were freaked out. We were all frantic about it. Like, just so you know.
Yeah. The truth of the matter is that thing will at some point probably get eaten by moths and or other critters because that will attract them.
I have a couple of museum questions for you now that we're on the topic. Have you ever been to the Museum of Surgical Science in Chicago?
Oh, yeah, of course. That's a great museum. They have some beautiful paintings in.
Oh, yeah. I think they have like a reproduction of a Vesalius book there. I didn't think it was an original.
I could tell you if I saw it. I'm like a Vesalius file. And now I'm actually like obsessed with Albrecht Dürer.
Oh, yeah. I know. You hear it all day.
I'm a huge Dürer fanatic. I hate to admit the fact that I don't own any original Dürers. I have some later renditions from the 17th and 18th century, which are very old, mind you, but they're not.
But they're not OG. It's not.
Right.
Oh, some of his original prints go for a couple $100,000.
Start saving, bud.
No, I'm good.
Have you been to the Museum of Funeral History in Houston?
No.
I have not, because I've not really been to Houston.
I've never been to Houston.
You haven't been to Houston.
No.
I was there once, but I unfortunately did not have time to go to that museum.
It's really cool. They have hearses and mourning jewelry and funeral ephemera.
Regina and I always have sort of toyed with the idea of getting a hearse, like an old horse-drawn hearse for our backyard.
I don't ever remember having that conversation.
You have mentioned it times over the past decade.
No.
You thought it would be cool. Now we have like a big yard to put one in.
Oh, please, no.
For October, the MCP is diving into the Salem witch trials, which is a completely happy accident because I plan my topics a year in advance and I had no idea that the book was coming out until you contacted me. It lines up with the title item in your book, The Witch's Door. Could you tell me about this item, which inspired the name of your book?
Well, it comes from the Nick Parmesan collection, which is this amazing collector in Brooklyn. It was sort of a hoarder situation, and we were on a very short time limit. Yeah, time frame of having to get everything out of his apartment after he passed away. And
thousands of objects.
Yes.
Might I add.
Yeah. So it took, about 3 days and tons of trucks and helpers. And honestly, it's taken over a year to sift through every object. And of course, there were the obvious things, we could recognize right away. And then there was this door that kind of got placed in the background because none of us knew what it was. And actually, if you didn't know, it really, just to look at, it's not very interesting.
It looks like a very antique door. It has some hardware on it. And if you look closer, it has some like crude carvings on it.
But we didn't notice that until much later. So like a year went by and then you finally got to that piece. And then Ryan was like, wait a second. Also, he knew at this point that the collector did not have things just for the sake of having things. Like there must have been a reason why this door was in this collection. And then Ryan, what did you discover?
So what happens a lot of the times is we will procure museum-worthy collections. When I say museum-worthy, I just mean that there's numerous pieces to the collection. That could be 10 pieces or that could be 3,000 pieces. I don't like to buy just one piece.
Not anymore.
No.
Yeah.
When you buy one piece, you either keep it or you sell it. Well, what happens with a larger collection is you get to part with the pieces that are not as important to you for the collection. And then you keep the best stuff. And with the best stuff, it just means that you get to learn more. You're always learning all this stuff. And so we had this door and we had 18 boxes of paperwork. And so we'd bring up like a box of paperwork every week and start sifting through it and be like, oh, this is in here, or oh, this is the photograph of this. And then finally, on the bottom of one of the boxes, there was this like junky, gross paperwork.
Yeah, it had stains.
Coffee stains.
Yeah.
Blood stain, I think.
I mean, I hope they were coffee stains, but there it was.
Yeah, there it was. This old paperwork. It was basically a little manifesto about the witch's door. And so as we started to read, we learned that it originally had come from a collector in New Hampshire who specialized in like folk art and primitive furniture. And he wasn't necessarily like an expert on witchcraft paraphernalia, but he was an expert on early types of wood and furniture, and also an expert on hardware and metals and such. And so we started to read through it and we gathered as much information as we could until there was no more information that we could find through the paperwork and also through research. There's not that many of these doors in existence.
But then, of course, it has the carving, Old Jeff, Jef, translates to witch.
Yeah, Old Devil. So there was a couple different markings, or there are a couple different markings on the door. One of the first things that I didn't notice that I found out along a year or two later was these compass wheels, which are circular orbs. And they were originally used to keep evil spirits away from something. So you won't just see it on a door. You'll often see it like carved into, the beam of a house.
What was it called again? Sorry, I missed that.
It's a compass wheel, basically just a circle. And you could see that it was made with a compass because I could see like the little tiny pinhole in the middle. And they were relatively perfect circles. One of the other things that I did when I first started to realize that this was possibly a witch's door is we sent it to the Peabody Essex Museum. While they couldn't necessarily like authenticate it without seeing it in person, they did say that it was like of the specific period, between 1625 and 1725, that, the wood makeup, the hardware style, and the actual like nails and screws that were used to put it together were of the period. And then there was another thing that I didn't notice, which was a little W. And the W wasn't actually a W. It was two V's that would stand for Virgin of Virgins, as in Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so those were all things that we took into consideration. And then obviously the obvious, which was Old Jeff and the crude carving of what looks like a little witchy woman standing atop a cat.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
It definitely has an aura to it, and it definitely has an energy to this piece. Mm-hmm. And every time we take it down from where we have it stored, we notice something new on it and some eerie feeling comes over it. It does with me, actually. It's one of the few pieces in the collection that has given me kind of like a strange feeling. It's not necessarily bad, but it's definitely an odd feeling. To know, realistically, what this was used for was to house someone that was supposedly accused of witchcraft.
But this is a good example of something that's in our collection that's still ongoing. So the research won't stop, and we have to find experts because we're not experts in this. So we'll see what happens with it.
But we liked that idea, which is what led to the name of the book, The Witch's Door, because it was this pivotal piece in the collection that we had information about. So we kind of go in and out of the story throughout the book. And towards the end, we get a little bit more in depth as to what we think it is and what other people think it is.
Hopefully by book number 2, we'll know.
The Witch's Discovery.
The Witch's Discovery.
It's fascinating. Like, it's a good title as well because you're kind of opening the door to your collection as well. And having been reading about the Salem witch trials for about a month now, the carvings on the door make me think like the door was protecting the witch as well, the supposed accused witch, from everyone else who was accusing her. So you've basically got a barrier, or the thing that this person could hide behind to a point to get away.
I like that. I like that thought process. I don't know if that was the case. I have sort of a more grisly history of it in my mind. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I don't even think I mentioned in the book was the other side of the door, which I assume would have been the side that the woman and or man, there's like deep scratches in the door.
Yeah, like fingernails.
Oh, geez.
I will say it is pine, and most likely the door was made out of the same type of pine that would have been used for floors, because oftentimes when they were making a door, it was just made out of like leftover pine wood that was put together with the metal hardware that's on there. Because you can take your finger and just like scratch into the wood. Pine is very soft.
Right.
But there are like noticeable scratches on this thing. It's very dark and it's a very creepy piece.
So it doesn't live inside of our house. Like,
No.
I can't have objects like that inside, especially if you can feel them. So it's on our property, but it doesn't live among us on a daily basis.
We've given away objects before. One of the most pivotal stories, I think, in the book is the story with the 2 ventriloquist dummies.
Yes.
Oh, and it's ongoing in real life.
Yeah, so that chapter occurred while we were done with the book. We actually had handed in the manuscript.
Yeah, it didn't start until the dolls were photographed for the book. That's when the mayhem started. And we ultimately gave the objects away, but they are definitely wreaking havoc on that owner.
They wreaked so much havoc, and I never get rid of things like that. I just gave them away. The trouble they were causing us was so strong and so dark and so awful that we just said, no, I can't do it anymore. And we ended up just letting them out of our house, and things went back to normal. And it's an easy thing to think, oh, well, this coincidence happened and that coincidence happened. And sometimes there can be a series of unsavory coincidences.
Because Ryan and I are very science. We can find a reason why something happened. But unfortunately, those 2 weeks, too many events that we couldn't explain.
Spooky.
So they're gone.
They're gone.
I think that is a wise decision. I don't understand when people keep things that disturb them so much. In general, just reading the book, I found myself smiling a lot. You both said things in your chapters that I identify with to my core, like the dream of living in a museum and the joy you feel when you finally discover the history of an item and you find someone else who understands how much it means to you to find these pieces. It was just a pleasure to read The Witch's Door, and I really hope it does well.
Thank you so much.
That. It was a really fun book to write. And, Reg and I have been featured in so many books at this point together. It was a matter of time before we created our own book. And, I think the obvious thing for everybody, even us, was to make this like coffee table picture book. And, we brought that to the publisher and they're like, yeah, that's great. I think we can do that in the future. I think what's more interesting is to hear the stories, and tell your tales of being, on the road and going on these things or uncomfortable situations. Like our honeymoon was like a total
nightmare. Yeah.
I think to this day, it probably you're pissed off at me about it. But it's also a fantastic story. And I still, like, as troubling as it is, it led to a lot of other interesting things.
Yeah. And I think I'm a very private person. So it was really weird for me to expose anything, especially talking about that or my parents or my background. So it was a little therapeutic for me, actually.
Same.
Thank you both so much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for having us and taking
the
time to talk to us and help promote our book. We're really proud of it, and we hope everyone enjoys it as much as we did.
Yeah, it's a speed read. Like, I just couldn't stop reading it.
Aww.
It was great.
That's great.
You're not the first person to tell me that. At first, I'm like, wait, is it not long enough? Is it not thought-provoking that it takes so quick to read it? But people said they did that because they were intrigued about what happens next and where does this story go? And so I think it's a very fun read. We try not to ever take ourselves too seriously. And so there's some good humor in it.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. The humor really helped. I mean, I spend most of my days reading history textbooks, so it was very refreshing.
Same.
Good, I'm glad.
You've actually inspired me to start expanding my own random collection of things.
Oh, if there's anything that I can do for society, I think that's probably about it. Influencing people to, spend all of their money on collectibles.
I haven't spent any money. I've been lucky.
That's what got me into this stuff to begin with, is that I realized a lot of it you can find in nature. And that was like one of the most intriguing.
And I can't even imagine like where you live, what you see.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. There's a fossil beach up the road as well that has echinoderms and shark teeth and really interesting stuff.
Absolutely.
I was down in my studio the other day and I realized that I had this box of like 100 megalodon teeth and they're huge. And I'm like, I don't know if I remember buying
only in Ryan's studio.
Yeah, it's like a wonderland down there.
Well, if we ever make it, I would love to go go to Australia one day. That
Same.
would be
It's on our
incredible.
bucket list.
I fully endorse that. It's a great spot. Lots of history.
We'll definitely let you know if we ever make it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye now.
The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.